According to former Easy Company platoon leader Lieutenant Jack Foley, Roy Cobb once stumbled back into camp at Haguenau drunk as a skunk, prompting Martin to draw his .45 pistol. Years later, Martin was adamant that he never intended to shoot him. The weapon was simply the quickest way to get Cobb's attention. He remembered hearing similar stories about Ronald Spears, who was said to have done, or at least threatened, much the same thing. In Martin's view, there were moments when a man had to be stopped before he became a danger to himself or everyone around him. Cobb had developed a reputation for drinking heavily. He spent much of his time searching for food and anything else that might be useful, but liquor was always high on his list. Whenever he found a stash of schnapps or other alcohol, he usually drank nearly all of it himself before returning with whatever little remained. Martin recalled that Cobb seemed a little unstable, although he quickly tempered the criticism by remembering the circumstances. They were all very young men, most from poor families, living through extraordinary conditions thousands of miles from home. It was hardly surprising that some coped better than others. Alcohol became a familiar part of life whenever the opportunity presented itself. David Webster later wrote extensively about the drinking in Haguenau, and even more so after the division reached Austria, reflecting on how alcohol became intertwined with the experience of combat and the lives of young soldiers trying to endure it. Martin shared that view to a point. Drinking certainly became widespread whenever liquor was available, but he never remembered it becoming a permanent problem. The men would drink heavily for a short time, exhausting whatever supply they had managed to find. Once it was gone, life simply returned to normal. None of the men he knew became alcoholics because of those episodes. Haguenau offered more opportunities than most places they had occupied. The company was often broken into small groups and billeted with French families, rather than sleeping in the open. Some of their hosts had bottles of cognac carefully hidden away from the Germans, bringing them out only after trust had been established. For the French, a single small glass at the end of the day was enough. The American paratroopers, however, approached the bottle very differently. Martin laughed at the contrast years later. A French civilian might be content with one careful shot of cognac before bed, but a group of young American GIs had no such restraint. Once the cork came out, the bottle was expected to be emptied before anyone thought about stopping. It was simply the way they were. Most of them were barely out of their teens, carrying the strain of months of combat and seizing every brief opportunity to forget the war, if only for an evening. Those moments of laughter and excess never lasted long. The bottles emptied quickly, the parties ended, and the realities of the front reclaimed everyone's attention. Before long, the men were back on the line, watching the opposite bank of the river, waiting for the next patrol, the next artillery mission, or the next burst of enemy fire that would shatter the temporary calm. The fighting at Haguenau bore little resemblance to the campaigns that had come before. In Normandy, Easy Company had advanced across the countryside in small groups, constantly on the move. Holland had combined periods of attack with defensive fighting, while Bastogne had been a desperate struggle for survival against relentless assaults and bitter winter conditions. Haguenau was something altogether different. It was, as Martin later described it, a holding position. The Modder River divided the opposing forces. American troops occupied one bank while German soldiers held the other, each side settling into buildings that offered a degree of comfort unimaginable during the frozen days in the Ardennes. Houses became squad positions, and command posts were established wherever a sturdy structure could be found. A squad leader might command 4 or 5 men from one house, while another squad occupied the next building down the street. Martin's platoon command post was established on the upper floor of a factory overlooking the river. From there, they maintained telephone lines directly to the supporting artillery batteries. It was a system that relied as much on observation as firepower. Among the men working beside him was Sergeant Marsh, another native of Columbus, Ohio. Together they watched the opposite bank through binoculars, studying every movement. The terrain across the river had already been divided into numbered grid squares on detailed maps. Whenever German activity was spotted, the coordinates were passed to the artillery. The procedure became almost routine. A single ranging round would be fired first, allowing the observers to judge its accuracy. If the shell landed too far beyond the target or fell short, corrections were telephoned back immediately. Once the aim was adjusted, the order was given to fire for effect, and an entire battery would unleash a concentrated barrage onto the selected position. It was a deadly partnership between the infantry observers and the guns positioned miles behind the lines. When they were not directing artillery fire, the men carried out combat patrols across the river under the cover of darkness. These missions were among the most dangerous assignments at Haguenau. Small groups crossed into enemy-held territory to gather intelligence, probe German positions, or capture prisoners. Every patrol risked stumbling into an ambush. During one such operation, Sergeant Mercier of 1st Platoon led a patrol across the river. Among the men with him was Private Eugene Jackson, one of Martin's closest friends. The patrol succeeded in capturing a German soldier, but before they could return safely, Jackson was critically wounded. When the patrol reached the American lines, the contrast was unforgettable. The captured Germans sat under guard, while the company medic fought desperately to save Jackson's life. The wounded paratrooper cried out in agony, begging his comrades to end his suffering. No one would grant such a request. As long as there was even the slightest chance of survival, the medics continued their work. Despite their efforts, Jackson later died from his wounds. For Martin, the sight proved almost unbearable. Watching one of his closest friends suffer while the German prisoner sat only a few feet away overwhelmed him with anger. He lashed out physically, repeatedly kicking the captive. Years later, he admitted he had no idea whether that particular German had fired the shot, or, as later accounts established, whether anyone had, since Jackson's wounds were actually caused by the premature explosion of one of his own grenades. In that moment, however, reason gave way to grief. The prisoner became the only visible symbol of the enemy responsible for so much loss. Martin later recalled that Easy Company occupied General Alexander Patch's sector during this period. Their mission was largely to hold the line, while larger Allied operations developed elsewhere. Compared with Normandy or Bastogne, Haguenau appeared almost quiet on the surface. Yet beneath that calm lay a constant tension. Every patrol across the river, every artillery adjustment, and every unexplained movement on the opposite bank carried the possibility that the uneasy stalemate could erupt into violence without warning. The long periods of relative quiet at Haguenau also gave the men time to think about the officers who led them. Like many enlisted soldiers, David Webster had written openly about what he saw as the gulf between officers and enlisted men. He was particularly critical of the privileges that accompanied a commission, and his writings reflected a lingering resentment toward the Army's rigid class structure. Martin admitted that he understood those feelings. The Army taught its soldiers that a salute was directed toward the rank, not the individual wearing it. That had never sat comfortably with him. Respect, he believed, had to be earned through character and leadership rather than insignia or education. A commission alone did not make a man worthy of admiration. Even so, Martin was careful not to paint all officers with the same brush. Some earned the respect of the enlisted men because they never allowed rank to separate them from the soldiers they commanded. Those officers understood that leadership depended on trust as much as authority. One of the best examples was Lieutenant Buck Compton. Martin never forgot the day Compton casually walked into the sergeant's quarters, sat down beside Joe Toye, Wild Bill Garnier, and the other non-commissioned officers and simply talked with them. There was no ceremony and no attempt to remind anyone of his position. He spent time with the men as equals, sharing stories and conversation. The gesture left a lasting impression. Carwood Lipton inspired much the same confidence after receiving his battlefield commission. By then he had already proven himself repeatedly under fire, and the respect he received came naturally. The men followed him because they trusted him, not because regulations required it. Not every officer inspired that kind of confidence. Lieutenant Peacock often struck the enlisted men as something of a joke, while Lieutenant Norman Dyke's shortcomings in combat became painfully obvious. There were officers, Martin acknowledged, who simply never should have been commissioned. Herbert Sobel, however, occupied a more complicated place in Martin's memory. Time had not softened the opinions of many Easy Company veterans. Sobel remained one of the most criticized figures in the company's history, and Martin understood why. Yet he also believed that much of the judgment was based on speculation rather than experience. Sobel had never been given the opportunity to lead Easy Company in combat. Whatever his faults as a trainer, no one could say with certainty how he would have performed under fire. Martin found it difficult to condemn a man who had never been allowed that test. Combat had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. Men who seemed fearless during training sometimes broke down completely once bullets began flying. Others, quiet and unassuming in peacetime, discovered remarkable courage when everything was at stake. He had even seen men deliberately wound themselves in order to escape the front. War revealed qualities that no amount of drilling or parade ground discipline could predict. For that reason, Martin rejected the popular claim that Sobel would have been killed by his own men within hours of entering combat. The story had circulated for years, repeated often enough that many accepted it as fact. Martin refused to do so. No one could honestly know what Sobel might have done until he had faced the same test as every other combat commander. Looking back, Martin suspected that personality played as much a role as military ability. Officers naturally formed friendships with one another, sharing meals, conversations, and the burdens of command. Within that circle, they developed their own ideas about what an easy company commander should be. Sobel simply did not fit their image. It was almost like a fraternity, Martin reflected years later. Every group has people they admire and others they dislike. That was true in the army as much as anywhere else. In the end, despite Sobel's flaws, Martin never saw much value in tearing him apart. History had already judged the man harshly enough. Whatever mistakes Sobel made at Toccoa and during training, Martin believed he deserved at least the fairness of being judged for what he had actually done, not for what others imagined he might have done. There were a few factual details that Martin's memory had blurred over the decades. Eugene Jackson, whose death remained one of his most painful memories, was not wounded by German gunfire during the Haguenau patrol, but by the premature explosion of one of his own grenades, a detail accurately depicted in Band of Brothers. Likewise, David Webster's famous confrontation with Lieutenant Peacock over sweeping the floor occurred earlier, while Easy Company was serving in Holland, rather than at Haguenau. Such small discrepancies were hardly unusual in veterans' recollections after half a century. What remained remarkably clear was not every technical detail of the events themselves, but the emotions attached to them, the friendships, the losses, the anger, and the respect that endured long after the war had ended. If you have a thought regarding John Martin's recollections, drop it in a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe.